After visiting and studying the culture in Guatemala, I noticed how modernization is being pushed upon the Mayan culture and traditions. Guatemalans need to think about the issue of whether to preserve their Mayan culture no matter what, or take on a more modernized way in order to survive or gain wealth. Should the indigenous people try to keep their ways and maybe have their culture fade away? Or will these indigenous people adapt to the modern ways and have their culture slowly disappear? This is a picture I took right outside the San Jose market near Cowitz. These Mayan men and women are in the middle of a funeral procession while carrying lit candles with respect. It is interesting to note here the big red Coca-Cola advertisement in the background. Traditional ways with modernization surrounding them can be seen here, whether they want it or not. The indigenous people of Guatemala first dealt with this competition of land, among other things, during the Civil War when the Ladinos entered Guatemala. The indigenous were living in the towns when the Ladinos came in to force them into the highlands, where there was less quality of land. In my second journal prompt, in which I discussed the issue of race, I explained how the indigenous were being pushed to the highlands because the Ladinos did not want to live there. In Tricia Kane's book, In Focus Guatemala, she writes how the geography of Guatemala still bears witness to these struggles, with the majority of the indigenous population living in remote, dispersed villages in the highlands, while Ladinos occupied towns and cities. The indigenous not only had and still have unequal access to resources, to land, and to wealth, but also, as we saw at the Palacio del Muy Noble Ayuntamiento, the indigenous had less access to weapons when fighting in this war. In reference to my journal, I noted how, in the arms room, we saw that the Mayans fought with bows and arrows, mallets, heavy wooden hammers, and wooden sword-like weapons. The Ladinos, on the other hand, used guns, cannons, and iron swords. This was most likely the first time the Mayans were pushed out of their norm, while another culture brought in their new ways. Looking back on our visit to Antigua, I noticed the amount of U.S.-owned stores. Both the restaurant across the street from our hotel, La Peña del Sol Latino, and the hiking company we used there, Old Town Outfitters, were U.S.-owned. Instead of markets covering all towns, now modern stores and U.S.-owned companies are being brought into Guatemalan cities. This again pushes out smaller Mayan-owned companies and businesses to make room for the more modern ones. In Cowitz, a small village in the highlands of Guatemala, we were able to visit both a bone healer and a medicine woman. The closest hospital to this community is about 5 hours away, so most people in this town or towns nearby use other sources of medical attention. Both the bone healer and the medicine woman depend on herbs and pass down knowledge of their healing process in order to do their work. The unique thing about the bone healer is how his medical knowledge of healing bones is a secret, which was passed down from his grandmother, including what he does and what he says during the treatment. Although traditional medicines are used with many Mayans, there is also more modern medicine that is being brought in, such as birth control. Should the Mayans continue with their traditional ways of medicine, or should they begin to use the modern medicines? I wrote in my journal how we talked with the bone healer and his patient. She said she would go to the hospital for more serious medical attention, but for bone injuries she would go to the bone healer. From what the patient, as well as what the bone healer said, it seems that the Mayans used both traditional and modern medicines. While walking through the markets of Antigua, I noticed how some people were wearing more traditional-looking clothes, while others were wearing more modern styles. Here is a picture of a mother wearing a traditional Mayan skirt, along with a hand-woven white top. Her daughter, however, is wearing a more modern style of jeans and a cotton t-shirt. Looking at this mother-daughter picture brings the idea of the older generation versus the newer generation. The older generation tends to have stronger feelings towards preserving their culture, such as wearing traditional clothing. The younger generation, on the other hand, seems to appear more modernized, most likely because of the access to television, radio, and clothing that has been brought upon that generation. In observing men's clothing versus women's clothing, it seemed as if men in Guatemala wore more modernized clothing, which was noticed both in small towns such as Cowitz and larger cities such as Guatemala City. Maybe some of the men feel like dressing more modernized means that they are taking a higher role in society. Going along with this, maybe the men feel the need to dress that way and become more modernized before the women do. Here's a picture of two men dressed in suits in Guatemala City, right outside of one of the museums we visited. Going along with the differences in clothing, there is also a noticeable difference in what is sold in the markets of Guatemala. Here is a picture of how both the modern and traditional materials are intertwined into Guatemala markets today. From this picture, you can see the handmade leather souvenirs and small coin holders hanging from the top, which represent the traditional. Towards the bottom, you can see the more modern-looking backpacks you might see in the U.S. A mixture of the two, culture and modernization, can be seen here. This is an image of a woman weaving, which was taken at the Women's Co-op in Antigua. Here, we can see how she is preserving the Mayan culture by doing this incredibly tedious hand weaving, which has been passed down from generation to generation. We can also see here how this women's co-op is being modernized, in a sense that it is women who are in charge here. In thinking about how a women's co-op gets started, I answered that it just takes one Guatemalan woman believing in herself and other women that they can step out of the norm and be successful. These women are trying to preserve their culture by weaving, but at the same time are being influenced by this modernization of women gaining new roles and responsibilities. What we can see here is how it is not really one way or the other. The culture is not totally being pushed out, nor is modernization completely taking over, but it is more of a mixture of the two. Although some Mayans might see modernization as pushing their culture away, this modernization also brings new roles for women. Traditionally, Guatemalan women have been known to work in the household and do chores, such as cleaning and cooking. Now, there are women who are holding more professional jobs, such as being a banker, a police officer, or a guard. Here is a picture of a woman guard standing in the corner, keeping an eye on the restaurant. This modernization has brought the idea into Guatemala that women can certainly hold more responsible roles other than the traditional household chores. I reflected in my journal how I think Guatemalan women are beginning to gain more respect, but it takes time. The U.S. went through this before the women's rights movement and are still seeing some struggles with women today. Similarly, in Guatemala, people are just beginning to let more and more women hold respectable jobs and responsibilities. Here is a picture of a painting I saw on the side of a building when we stopped at Lima for our boat tour out of Panajachel. Each person might have a different view of what this painting means, but I interpret it as this is what is going on in the Mayan man's head. In the image, you can see someone weaving, a computer and keyboard built on someone's head almost like a sombrero is worn, a man carrying a cell phone, and a school setting near the bottom. The medium-sized face on the right might represent a Ladino man. I see this as different things this Mayan man has to deal with. He is thinking of both the traditional ways, such as weaving, built in with modern items like the computer. So this man is uncertain about which way his life is heading. Referring back to my proposed questions near the beginning of, should the indigenous people try to keep their ways and maybe have their culture fade away? Or will these indigenous people adapt to the modern ways and have their culture slowly disappear? After seeing these pictures, you might wonder, do these indigenous people of Guatemala really have a choice of lifestyle between the more modernized or traditional life? There is no white or black answer here. The Mayans in Guatemala do not really have a choice of whether they want this modernization or not. O'Kane states in her book how it is impossible to quantify how many Maya are affected by the cultural, economic, and educational factors which encourage or force individuals to integrate into the dominant Ladino culture. The Mayans cannot escape this modernization. Ladinos started bringing in their modern ways back when the Civil War was going on and have continued, along with other outside influences as well. The reality is that it is a blending of the current traditions along with the new modern ways.